Hello, welcome. The Northwestern Pacific was a line that ran north of San Francisco from Sausalito and Tiburon up to Eureka, some 330 miles in length, primarily a lumber hauling enterprise, hauling lumber from the timber-rich region of northwestern California. It was a conglomeration of many smaller roads, 41 predecessor operations, that would finally merge into the NWP in 1907, being jointly owned by the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific Railroads. Santa Fe would sell their interest to the SP in 1929, and the NWP would be an SP subsidiary until finally being sold off decades later. The NWP had its own roster of steam locomotives, mostly 440 Americans and 460 10-wheelers, but as business continued to grow, parent SP would lease additional locomotives to the NWP beginning in 1934 with 280 consolidations. The railroad's track through the canyons of the Eel and Russian rivers were always in need of maintenance due to the heavy rains which would play havoc with the roadbed, but the Eel River Canyon's unstable natural geology was especially a constant problem of sinks and heaves, as well as frequent slides. Lumber from the northern coastal counties would be loaded onto the 40-foot flat cars of the era. Train lengths could be typically 40 to 50 cars, and 10-wheelers and consolidations would muster the loads. All the while, the steam-era trackage would require constant attention, but the lumber would continue to move. Steam operations would last until 1953 on the NWP, but by August, the last of SP's steam power was returned to the parent company. In an effort toward dieselizing the road, the first of 17 Baldwin AS616s would arrive on the NWP in 1949. While these large 1,600 horsepower units provided the needed power for its operations, the Baldwin's rigid three-axle trucks proved to be hard on the relatively light rail of the road. In 1950, the electromotive division of General Motors would produce a 1,600 horsepower locomotive, the TR6 A and B. This was a two-unit cow and calf locomotive with a cab unit permanently coupled by a fixed drawbar to a booster unit. While having the same horsepower as the Baldwins, the TR6 A and B's weight was distributed onto 4 BB trucks, which was easier on the rail. And the EMD product was shown to have about 20% more pulling power than the Baldwins. So, in 1951, the first of 4 TR6AB sets arrived. For about the next 2 years, these units would work side by side with their older steam brethren. These units worked for the most part on the northern half of the railroad. At times, the TR6s would double head with their steam counterparts. The 4 TR6AB pairs were the only ones the SP would ever purchase. The TR6 pairs themselves eventually would be returned to the parent SP, and the units would be separated, having their drawbars replaced with couplers. The calf units were soon coupled to SW8s equipped with slow speed controls and would perform duties such as working the hump yard at Roseville. The TR6 cab units, essentially SW8s themselves, would be reassigned to other parts of the SP system. A couple of them could be found in service on SP's Pacific Electric in Southern California. In 1952, yet another new EMD model, the SD7, would appear on the NWP, having 1,500 horsepower and riding on 2 three-axle trucks like the Baldwins. These, however, would prove to be more flexible and easier on the rail of the NWP. On its demonstration tour, EMD's demonstrator, number 990, was assigned to pull passenger trains number 3 and 4, the Eureka Express, on several trips. After its appearance on the NWP and finishing its demonstration tour on other roads, It would soon return to EMD's LaGrange shops for a once-over servicing and, having been purchased by the Southern Pacific, would receive a new tiger stripe paint job, then return once again to the NWP as SP's 5308. Being EMD's first six-axle locomotive, the former demonstrator can be considered the granddad of all following generations of EMD six-axle locomotives. It still exists and is now preserved in operating condition at the Illinois Railway Museum as SP 1518. Today, this 1951 model is still running, probably doing much better than I, to be sure. Indeed, the SP would buy 43 units of this model, and 40 of them would see service on the NWP at some point in their careers. The SD7 would be the NWP's mainstay locomotive throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, with usually about 20 to 25 of them being on the roster at any given time. Initially, all of the new SD7s were painted in the tiger stripe scheme from the factory, but later, in the mid-50s, they would receive the very cool Black Widow scheme. With their large barrel headlights, they were quite a sight. Besides their big lights, another piece of equipment that added to a most unique look for these locomotives was the spark arresters that the NWP's Tiburon shops added. I have yet to model this on my fleet, but it is, for sure, on my to-do list. These homemade spark arresters were screens that sat above the exhaust outlets and looked like small chimneys. This homemade apparatus played a most important role on this road, as it traversed through such a forested route. But even with these, it is suspected that several tunnel fires were started by sparks emitted from locomotive exhaust settling into the wood supports of the tunnel. Tunnel fires were just one more nightmare this road had to contend with. Slides and washouts were the rule rather than the exception on the NWP. Beyond those constant disruptions, some of which caused major derailments, with some having fatal consequences, historic epic floods would destroy many, many miles of track and roadbed, as well as completely wash away major steel truss bridges as log jams of lumber would pile up on them. The winter of 1955 would be a bad year for the road, to be sure, but the Great Flood of 1964 would leave the road closed for 177 days, while much of the railroad was rebuilt. In fact, when one reviews the history of the line, it's hard to realize how time and again so many millions would be spent on its continuing operation. Indeed, even after the SP threw in the towel and sold off the north half of the line, north of Willits, even yet, efforts would be made to continue operations by the Eureka Southern, which itself went bankrupt trying to continue on. And still yet, another attempt was again made by the North Coast Railroad, which eventually had to face reality when it too could no longer keep the line open. In 1958, we see steam generator equipped number 5327 pulling train number 4, the Redwood, on its way north, or Railroad East, up to Eureka. It is painted in SP's economized Halloween or pumpkin scheme. In November of '58, the Redwood would no longer run from San Rafael, but would only run between Willits and Eureka on the NWP's north half. Bud Rail diesel car, SP number 10, recently released from its Oakland to Sacramento duties, would now take up service on the NWP. After having suffered damage from a grade crossing incident in 1960 in which it tangled with a logging truck at Fort Seward, one end of the car would be rebuilt, leaving it with controls on only one end, meaning, of course, that it would have to be turned at each end of its runs. It would hold down this assignment as train numbers 3 and 4 until 1971, when Amtrak came into existence, allowing this route to be discontinued finally. In addition to SD7s arriving on the scene, the NWP would see SW8s and SW900s arrive in the early 1950s. These roster additions would coincide with the last of NWP's steam operations. The SW8s were equipped with dynamic brakes. The SW900s were not. Here is SW900 4632. I need to change its number to 4633, which came to the road in 1954 and would serve another 16 years at least on the NWP. Another EMD model that would come to work on the NWP was the SW1, my personal favorite. SP 1000 was SP's very first diesel freight locomotive purchase, bought in 1939. Here, the 1000 holds down duties working the car float and the yard at Tiburon. It would be orphaned for a time on the south end of the road, following a 1961 tunnel fire just to the north that would isolate it from the rest of the railroad. It would continue to operate the horseshoe line between Tiburon and Sausalito, receiving and delivering cars to Santa Fe's car float at Tiburon during the next 6 years that the line remained separated. Its 600 horsepower was perhaps not the greatest, but it was sufficient to service the very south end of the Northwestern Pacific in the 1960s. The once all-electric Petaluma and Santa Rosa would also see dieselization. GE 44 tonners would appear on that road in 1947. Here we see P&SR number 3 and 4, which replaced two earlier 44 tonners, number 1 and 2, because they lacked MU ability. Though the SD7s worked well for more than a decade on the NWP, they too would be replaced, for the most part, by 1,750 horsepower SD9's in the latter 60s. These SD, or special duty units, were noted for their smooth riding characteristics by the crews, and they were soon tagged Cadillacs, the SD7s being tagged baby Cadillacs. But one thing was for sure, when one would think of the NWP, automatically Cadillacs would be in the picture that we would remember. Working Railroad West, coming south from Eureka, here's a big lash-up of SD9's tiptoeing over the trestle work at Scotia. By the 1970s, the NWP was trying hard to increase the tonnage it held. More and more horsepower was lashed up together. Trains of 100-plus cars weighing over 11,000 tons were becoming the norm. In fact, in the early 70s, SD40s, SD45s, U33s, and tunnel motors could be seen working all the way to Eureka. Even Union Pacific SD40s could be seen occasionally. But after a short while, their use on the north end, north of Willits, would be questioned, with certain officials wondering what this big power was doing to all the bridges and trestles. So, soon the big power was restricted to the south half of the road. But lash-ups of SD9s were increasing in number of units assigned. Usually during this period, a train might be led by 6 units, with as many as 6 helper units cut in behind. But I've seen as many as 8 SD9s lashed up together on the head end. And while I am certainly no expert on the matter, I have often wondered how this rather fragile road could support all of that action. But evidently, throughout the 70s it did, seeing even larger car capacities increase over the years. It seemed almost miraculous that these long, heavy trains could continue over this road. Throughout the 70s, the Southern Pacific would rebuild much of its locomotive fleet. All of the SD9 fleet would go through Sacramento's shops to be upgraded, and essentially a rebuilding that would hope to add another 15 years of life to these units. Following their rebuilding, many would once again be assigned duty on the NWP. Though rebuilt and getting new paint jobs in the process, time would take its toll soon enough, and these units would see a good deal of weathering. I suppose it only reflected how things were going for the NWP, not to mention parent Southern Pacific. Even with what was assumed by many to be a great chance to regain its corporate health through a merger with the Santa Fe, indeed, it was not to be, as the merger was refused. But not before the great anticipation of the event led both roads to paint some of their fleet into a new scheme reflective of both roads. So, in closing, as we watch these Cadillacs work into the era where even a shouldn't paint so fast Kodachrome unit appears in the contest, I would just like to thank you for your patience in viewing these different generations of equipment on the layout. And while I readily recognize how this goes against the usual modeler's convention of staying within a specific era, I readily admit that my railroading interests have continued to provoke me, if you will, into these leapfrogs in time, which allow me to enjoy the hobby even so much more. And, true, while most things change over time, making it hard to model different eras with their particular equipment, still yet, a lot of things remain unchanged, allowing us a bit of a chance to combine the newer with what still exists from the past. I only hope you enjoyed skipping through the years as well as you watched in here. Thanks again. Thanks for looking in.